Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Sampson from the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. And this is the latest in the RPTS webinar series. Today is October 6th, 2011, and I am your host. Just a couple of things for you as you're continuing to log in. There's a chat box in the bottom left-hand corner. Use that to ask any questions during the webinar, and our presenters will get that information and be able to answer your questions. We have a Q&A section at the end of our webinar today. Also, if you're having problems technically with the software or perhaps your audio, please type in there, and I will help you out with that as we go. As with all things, our webinars here are sponsored by RP Missions. As you see on the screen, we're grateful for the use of this webinar service at their courtesy. Our presenters today are Pastor Dave Long from the Lafayette congregation and his daughter Katie, and they're here to talk about their family and the things that the Lord has been doing with them. So without any further ado, Dave and Katie, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate that, and it's good to be with all of you that are logged on here today. We've never done anything quite like this, so a new experience for both Katie and myself. And I think a little bit different kind of webinar, at least the webinars I've listened to in the past. This is really not a teaching session so much as it is a testimony, where Katie and I are just going to share with you some of her story. And I just want to let you know how thankful we are to all of you. We've had an incredible amount of people that have prayed for Katie and for our family over the last 10 or 11 years, and we're very, very grateful for that. The kind of support that we've received has been phenomenal, and we just don't stop thanking God for what He's done. We haven't very often told the story from the beginning to the end in an attempt to draw lessons, the things that God has taught us, but we were prompted to do this last spring, where Katie and I were invited to speak at a father-daughter banquet down in Indianapolis and on this very subject. So it kind of got us thinking and got us working toward pulling together the vast amount of stories and the vast amount of things that God had been doing in our lives and our hearts. And so this afternoon we're going to try and just share some of those things. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview here at the start, and then Katie's going to share her story, and then I'll come back and share a few things that the Lord did in my life and my heart and our families as we wrestled through the events. You know, there are times when things happen in life, and I'm sure all of you have experienced this, where life just kind of freezes in that moment. Events that are really, really significant, that they just get etched in your mind so that you don't ever forget them. Even though at the time that they happen, you know, we don't usually know the full implications of that event. I had an event like that in my life. It was back on a nighttime. It was after dinner in January of 2004. I remember it like it happened yesterday. I was standing at our kitchen sink. I was just helping clean up after dinner. I was in the kitchen by myself, and Katie walked into the kitchen, and she said, "Dad, I want to talk to you about something. I've been thinking a lot about it, and I think I want to have the surgery on my back." And I just remember this pit in my stomach. I closed my eyes as I stood there, and this sense of dread just kind of settled in my heart. And it wasn't that I thought that what Katie was saying was unreasonable or the conclusions she had come to were the wrong conclusions. I had been thinking the same thing for some time, that this was going to be necessary. But the doctor had explained to us the severity of the surgery. He told us that just the recovery itself would likely take up to about a year. And we just realized if she ever had the surgery, she would in essence lose that year of her life in school and that kind of thing. What we didn't know, what I didn't know then and Katie didn't know then, was that this would be only the first of 3 surgeries, and it would totally redirect her life and would totally impact all of our lives for the next 7 or 8 years. Katie had discovered that she had scoliosis back in 2000. She was actually on an echo trip, a missions trip with the youth of our presbytery down in Florida, and one of the girls just noticed that her spine was really, really crooked. And Katie had been having some back pains, and she'd spoken to her mom, Jenny, and myself about that at different times, and we just said, well, you need to sit up straighter, and you need to quit slouching, and of course you got back pains. Look at the way you're sitting, that kind of thing. That was the first time when she came home from echo that we realized there was a problem. So we started seeing doctors, first in Lafayette, then eventually we went to specialists in Indianapolis. And they watched it for quite a while, and it got worse for a while. She had quite a bend in her spine and a twist, both. And things didn't get better. They got worse, and then the pain just increased. And so by the time that Katie talked to me that day in January of 2004, we just were realizing, and the surgeon was saying, I think it's about time. So she had that first surgery then in September of 2004, and they actually they did the surgery from the inside. In other words, they went through 2 of her ribs from the front side and did the correction to her spine on the inside. And the result of that surgery was she had 2 rods inserted. I think there were 16 screws and 16 hooks, and they fused 8 vertebrae and removed in the process 7 discs. And the idea, of course, was to straighten her spine. And so that was the first surgery. And what we didn't find out until much later, we'll tell you more about as we go on, is that surgery ended up failing. The point was fusion, and she failed to fuse. It took us a long time to figure that out, but when we finally did, in August of 2007, she had to have a second surgery, in essence, to accomplish what the first surgery was supposed to do. They couldn't go on the inside again, so this one was from the back. This was an external surgery. We went to Sacramento, California for the surgery. A doctor named Dr. Pachetti performed it and put in more hardware, more rods and hooks and screws and that kind of thing in order to stabilize her spine and to cause it to fuse. We thought that would be the end of it, but then her pain came back, and it eventually became evident that she was going to have those same rods and hooks and screws removed from the second surgery because they were actually causing a great deal of pain. They accomplished what they needed to accomplish, so they weren't necessary anymore. A fusion had occurred, but she had to have a third surgery to take those things out. So over the course of these years, starting in 2000 up until now, there's been a lot of pain, a lot of issues with drugs, and lots of lessons that God has taught us. So I just want to turn it over to Katie at this point. I want Katie to she's just going to tell you things that God did in her life and whatever she wants to share in terms of the events of these last few years. So Katie, why don't I give it to you?
Okay, well, I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to share with you what God's done in my life because of His incredible mercy and grace through those several years of suffering. If I hadn't known the Lord through those years of suffering, I don't think I would be here today. I think I may have taken my life into my own hands. I'll be the first person to admit that I didn't always handle my suffering in the most godly attitude, but God was always faithful, and He used the chronic pain that I experienced every day for all those years to draw me closer to Himself, and so that's what I'd like to share with you. Before my first surgery, I was really nervous about how I might respond to the intensity of pain that I knew I was going to experience after surgery, and I was nervous about if I would ever wake up in the hospital and be alone or if there wouldn't be anybody around to help me. And I really wanted to glorify God, but I didn't know what those experiences would be like. So I just prayed that before surgery, I prayed that God would just be near to me in those times if they occurred, and that I would honor Him. After my first surgery, I woke up in the recovery room, And the surgery had been a 10-hour surgery, and so my body was really swollen, and my eyes were completely swollen shut, so I saw nothing but blackness. And my parents weren't there. They could only come in for about 10 minutes every 2 hours, and they weren't there at the time. And I just felt really scared, and I asked a nurse who I could hear was nearby for some ice for my mouth because it felt really dry. And he left, and it felt like he was gone for a really long time. And so when he finally came back without the ice, I decided to ask him for two things, thinking if I ask him for two things, maybe he'll realize that I really do need help. And so I did that, and he said, I can only do one thing at a time, and then he left again. So I started to cry out for my parents and just call for their help. Even though I knew they weren't there, I just felt really desperate. And finally another nurse said, your parents can't come in for another hour and 10 minutes. And then she went back to her work. And I just felt so scared and so alone, and I just began to realize I could not depend on human help at that time. And I realized I was completely dependent on God. And so I started just crying out to God, and I just said, please hear me, God. I'm so scared and alone, and it's so dark. So just be near me and give me comfort. And then I began to think of verses that I'd read before my surgery, and the words of Psalm 23, verse 4 came into my mind. And I thought, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And then something I never felt before suddenly surrounded me. A sense of complete peace came over me, and I felt like I saw someone next to me, which is strange because my eyes were swollen shut, so I couldn't actually see anything. He didn't say anything, but his presence spoke louder than words, and his presence was saying, I am with you, I am comforting you. And then I fell back asleep. After my surgery, I was having my quiet time in the book of Job, and what really struck me about Job was his response to losing when he lost all of his possessions and all of his children had died. And his first response was to tear his robes and fall on the ground and worship God. And then later, when he was inflicted with physical suffering, his wife encouraged him to curse God and die. And he said, shall we receive good from God but not receive evil? And I was just really struck with his response to suffering. And so I prayed that no matter what kind of suffering I would face, that I would never curse God, but that I would worship him in those times instead. Jared Olivetti was the associate pastor at our church at the time, and every week he would come over to see me and to see how I was doing and encourage me in the Word. And he asked me one day if I felt like I'd lost my identity. I said that I had felt that way because I'd always been really happy, and I was really involved in life and school activities and friends and church, and just been a really happy person. But now I wasn't involved in anything. I wasn't doing school or work, and all my friends had gone off to college, and I wasn't even thinking about my future. I was just trying to get through each day, and I just didn't feel happy anymore. And he said to me, it seems like God has kind of stripped you of everything you had before, maybe to help you realize where your true identity lies. If you find your identity in Christ now, then when you go back to having those things you had before, you will not find your identity in them, but always in Christ, because he's the foundation of who you are. And as I thought about this, I began to feel a real sense of freedom in the realization that as a Christian, Christ is the one thing and the only thing that cannot be stripped away from me. And considering that if Christ is what defines who I am, then I'm not lost in this period of uselessness or just waiting for better things to happen in my life. And so I began to gain just a new realization of the claim of that what had been laid on my life so many years ago when I had become a Christian. I realized how unstable an identity consisting of worldly claims was compared to the unshakable name of Christ, who promises that he'll never leave me or forsake me, and that nothing can separate me from his love. I did get better, though, and those things that I had lost came back in my life, and I was able to start going to school again and start working again, and I actually moved into an apartment with some friends, and I just remember thinking how glad I was that I would never have to suffer such pain again. But then Oh yeah, I forgot to change the slide. Thank you, Dad. But then my pain did return, and um, even though I didn't know it, I spent the next 3 years living with a broken spine. And every day my pain was increasing and getting worse and worse. And I went back on pain medications, and it made sitting through classes really hard. It was hard to stay awake, and when I went to work, I'd spend a lot of time either rushing to the bathroom to be sick to my stomach because of how bad the pain was, or suddenly just sitting down in the middle of the retail shop floor to keep from passing out because of the pain, or going to the back room just to cry out in pain for a moment because I just needed the relief. I moved back and forth from my apartment to my parents' house several times so that they could help take care of me. I never thought anything could be as painful as the first surgery had been. But when I was in the hospital in California for my second surgery, there were times the pain was so severe I actually thought I might go insane. I remember lying in bed and looking in front of me, and I saw a line. And on one side of the line, there was blackness and a place where if I quit fighting the pain, my mind would no longer have consciousness of life or reality or even know who I was. And on the other side of the line was the hospital room and my body lying in bed, writhing in pain. And from my church, Carla Kessler sitting next to me, calling out my name, saying, "Katie, you can get through this. We're going to fight through this pain." And God was just faithful in all of these seemingly horrible circumstances. He gave me parents who refused to give up and finding me help and taking care of me day after day, and a church full of people who weren't only praying for me, but actually sitting next to me and helping me fight through the pain. Another year of recovery passed, and I was still in pain, and I was still on medications, and I didn't understand why, but I had improved some, and I just felt like I needed to start moving on with life and trying to live again. And so my sister Christy and her husband invited me to live with them, knowing that I still needed the help and support of family, but and that I wanted to live on my own and feel some independence. I loved living with them, and they are just some of my closest friends, and were so amazing in their support to me as I continue to live in pain every day and deal with the effects of pain medications. After my first two surgeries, I really started having a lot of fear about experiencing pain like I'd experienced ever again in the future. And I started having nightmares about being forced into the operating room for a third surgery. I was struggling with post-traumatic stress from what had seemed like endless years of pain and 2 back surgeries and some really painful injection procedures. I'd go to bed at night, and I'd just start thinking about all the things that had happened, and I would just send myself into this emotional spiral downhill until I was just crying and really upset, and it was like that every night, and I couldn't imagine how I would ever go on if I had to ever experience such suffering again. And it was with thoughts like these that it was clear I hadn't yet come to understand the power and the grace of God. Someone encouraged me to consider Philippians 4:8 when thinking about those traumatic experiences. And that verse says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things." And so instead of pretending that the things in my past hadn't happened, I just started thinking about them in the context of what was true and what was right and what was honorable and lovely. And what I found was that in all of those circumstances, God was always there, and he was always giving me blessings through all those things, like family who never left my side, and a church who gave so much to help me and encourage me and keep me uplifted, and relatives sending me things just to lift my spirits. And then I wasn't actually able to come off of the pain medications, and my pain began to increase again. even more. So, and I went back to California to see my doctor in California again, and he took me into another injection procedure to determine the cause of my pain. This is the type of procedure where they sedate you enough that you can't fight against them in what they're doing, but not enough that you're not aware of what's going on. And this is because they want you conscious enough to cry out in pain when they stick you with needles in the most painful parts of your body. And they did this to determine where the problems were. I didn't know what was going to happen that day. And when I came out of that procedure, I learned that I was going to have another surgery. And 4 months later, I went in for my third back surgery. There were times where I mentioned before how if I hadn't known the Lord, how I might have taken my life into my own hands. And sometimes I just simply felt so weary from the constant pain with no end in sight that I just didn't want to live anymore. And relief sat in a little orange bottle on my nightstand. And one evening I lifted myself up off the floor and I went over to my nightstand and I took the lid off the bottle and I poured a pile of white narcotic pills into my hand. And as I sat there looking into my hand, I heard the echoing words of people in my church saying, "Don't give in to drug addiction. You can get through this. We're here for you." And then I thought, God knows what I'm doing, and I'm accountable to him for my actions. I can't do this. So I poured the pills back into the bottle, and in tears I prayed, Lord, give me the strength to fight the pain because I'm so tired and I just don't have the strength. I need your strength. Revelation paints such a beautiful picture of heaven when it says, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning nor crying nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. Instead of taking my own life, I prayed that God would take me home. But when he never did, I knew he must have a reason to keep me here. There were times when I didn't feel the presence of God. I'd laid in my bed day after day, month after month, and I read my Bible and I prayed, but I didn't always feel like God was hearing me or that he was answering me. And I began to question if he was there or if he had put me into this suffering and forgotten about me. And so I went and I talked to Dad and I asked him, where was God? And he explained, our emotions change all the time, but God is always faithful and his word is always true. When God promises, I will never leave you or forsake you, then that's true no matter whether I feel his presence or not. The basis of my faith must be on the truth of God's word and not on my emotions. But then there were also times where I felt such a closeness with God that words aren't even enough to explain what it was to feel such a close presence with the Lord. But I'm going to try because there was a moment after my third surgery when the pain was so severe, and I'd been on narcotic pain medications for 4 solid years, 5 years total, and the medications were beginning to really take a dangerous grip on my body and on my mind, and I just started shutting everyone out. And one night I went into my room and I closed the door, and I turned off the light, and in the darkness of the room I laid on the floor, and in anguish I just dug my fingers into the roots of my scalp, and I wanted to cry, but I wasn't even able to bring tears to my eyes. And I wanted to pray, but I didn't even know how to pray. So I just whispered to God and I said, Lord, pray for me because I don't even know how to pray for myself. And silently I just laid there waiting on God. And then in that moment I felt around me an engulfing closeness with the presence of God. It was this silent communion. There were no tears. There were no words. It was just me and God sitting together, and the truth of God's promise, I will never leave you or forsake you, playing out in such a deeply personal way. And now, instead of looking back at that moment and remembering it as one of the most anguished moments of my life, I remember that moment with such a fondness and a longing for that closeness with God that I think only deep suffering or heaven itself can bring. I felt a closeness with God so real and personal and precious that I knew the words of David Hansen at a college conference a few years earlier were true when he said, if the greatest suffering you can experience causes you to draw even one step closer to God, then it's worth it. As a lot of people do when they suffer, I asked why. And I wanted to know why God was allowing me to suffer so many years of such intense pain. So I started at the beginning, where I saw that pain and suffering was first brought into the world as a result of our sin. And this made me question if maybe God was punishing me for some sin in my life. But then through conversations with Dad and Jared, I was pointed to the cross, where I realized that Jesus Christ had already paid the punishment for my sin. So while suffering can be a consequence for our actions, he wasn't out to punish me for my sin. So then I asked, well, if that wasn't it, why was God allowing this suffering? And as I continued to explore the question, the answer I found gave me more hope and courage to go on than I could have imagined. I realized that for the Christian, God may allow suffering in order to reveal himself in a way that we don't experience in the same way in the ease of life. And another reason I discovered God might allow suffering is to use this as a testimony for his grace and his power. Through our faith in suffering, we can glorify his name. And I saw and heard of numerous people, and I know, just looking at the list, I know a lot of you, or all of you, were praying for me at times. I realized that those people, I heard numerous people praying for me. I realized that my suffering was causing those people to seek Christ and seek God in faith, which really could only enhance his glory. So when I think about suffering now, I think this slide's wrong.
Yeah, I think you're done with your slides, Katie.
Okay. All right, there. Sorry. All right. Well, anyway, when I think about suffering now, I know that apart from God, if I were to face suffering in my future, apart from God, I would be really afraid and really hopeless. But with Christ, I'm able to walk through the fires of suffering with courage and confidence in God, and knowing that there's a purpose, as suffering is an opportunity to bring glory to God and to know him better. I don't want to suffer, and I don't like it when hard things come, but because of what I've learned about Christ, I don't have to live in fear of suffering. And I think that one thing I've learned is that to suffer is to know Christ, and what greater privilege is there, really, than to know the one who has suffered for me? So that's all I have, but thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Katie. I want to share a few things from my perspective and from Jenny's. During each of these different surgeries that Katie had in the months leading up to them and going through the process, I just found God was bringing to surface in my life heart issues, things that he wanted to address in my life by his grace. So, I learned a lot of things. If Jenny was on the line here on the line, she would share things that she learned as well. We all walked this walk together. Three things that I want to share, kind of each paralleling each of the surgeries. During that first surgery back in 2004, I think the thing that I had to deal with most in my own heart was fear. I described that as that emotion that I felt there standing at the kitchen sink, when Katie told me she was ready to have the surgery. That was just one of many times my heart was just really filled with a lot of fear. The surgery, that first surgery she had, that was an endurance test. I went for 10 hours in the hospital. We had a lot of friends, a lot of family that were there supporting us, but I just remember feeling a real sense of loneliness, a real sense of sadness, fear that was in my heart. There's nothing quite so hard as sending your daughter off into the hands of a surgeon when you know that the consequences are going to be so intense and so prolonged that it's going to bring this incredible pain to her. It's going to last for not just weeks but for months. And I just kind of couldn't get that out of my head. And the reality of it was worse than what I had anticipated. The first clue of the horrors of it came for us when Jenny and I finally got to go in the recovery room, and we could hardly recognize Katie. Her face was so swollen, and she was so afraid, and we could hardly recognize her, and we weren't allowed to stay but a couple of minutes, and then we're out. and then an hour and a half later they let us go in again. But it was very, very difficult for us to see her in that. And then things just didn't go well post surgery. She was in the intensive care unit for 9 days, in just agony, and things were just escalating with her problems. She started to have some lung troubles and some other things that weren't going right. And Jenny and I just stayed at the hospital I think she was there for 10 days. We took shifts, sitting at her bedside all night long. And it was just hard to watch her suffer. And so this fear, is there because we wanted to take that from her. We wanted to relieve her. We didn't know what it meant. We didn't know where things were going to go. But God was with us during this whole process, and I have no doubt of that. I'm realizing I'm forgetting to change the slides too. But a verse that I think Katie shared was also a significant verse for me. Isaiah 41:10, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And the Lord used His Word to give us, to help us deal with our fear. And the Lord used people. And that was one thing that was a theme throughout all of this ordeal, is there were God's people, the church, family. People were there to support us. They visited Katie, and they visited us, and they cared for how we were doing and how we were feeling. And we had a lot of confidence that the Lord was in all of this. Keith and Becky McGill, just one example of a couple that was with us throughout all the procedures. And but they represent many who made great sacrifices to stand alongside us and to help us in our time of trouble. And it really did help alleviate the fear, because we recognized that these people represented in one sense the presence of God, and His Word was with us to help us. So that was kind of the first surgery, and Katie began to recover with that, and she had about a year's recovery, as the doctor had anticipated. And after a year, she was off all of her medication, and she had another 6, 7, 8 months really where she was pain-free. Looked like her life was back on track again. And then all of a sudden, the pain began to return again, and it was hard to see because it just kind of did grow and it began to escalate. And with that growing pain, there was a sense of hopelessness that began to come into my own heart, because we just couldn't solve the problem. And I'm a pretty optimistic guy. I don't get down very easily. But when Katie began to suffer this pain again, I did begin to feel a sense of, is there an answer? We tried to find a solution to her problem for over a year. And Jenny really worked hard at this. She was on the internet constantly looking for solutions. We went, of course, back to her surgeon. He said, I have no idea why she's in pain. Everything looks good. There's no reason that she's in pain. I can't do anything for you. And basically said, take drugs, take pain medicine. And so we went to other doctors, and we went to multiple doctors looking for answers, and nobody could give us a solution. And I remember on more than one occasion coming home from work at the end of the day and would find Katie on the living room floor just writhing in pain, in just such intense agony that and it just broke my heart, broke Jenny's heart. We just couldn't do anything. And those literally have been some of the saddest days of my entire life. But I also know hopelessness is not a biblical state. As believers, we're not to be without hope. As long as God lives and rules, which is for eternity, there is hope. And so one of the things that we began to recognize is that God was going to meet us in this sense of hopelessness, that God was going to help us conquer this, and was going to help me conquer my sense of hopelessness. And, of course, the first answer to that is faith. God calls on me to believe the promises of God. And verses that, we've known and we kind of quote at different times took on a deeper meaning for me. James 1, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. We began to hang on those kind of promises, realizing that God is behind these things. There's nothing that God's not in control of. There's nothing that's happening here that would turn us away from that, and we simply need to believe Him. So that was one thing that we needed to recognize, that I needed to recognize. Secondly was the issue of perseverance. Hopelessness often is overcome simply as we persevere. The story of Joshua and the conquering of Jericho, and then the defeat at Ai. And Joshua was really discouraged, a sense of hopelessness. Here we are in the land. You told us to take the land, and now this little tiny town has defeated us. And he had that sense of hopelessness. And God's response was, rise up. Why is it that you've fallen on your face? God didn't even want Joshua praying at that moment, which is kind of interesting. He wanted him to take action. There were things he wanted him to do. We told Katie when this pain came back and just kept growing, month after month after month, it was getting worse. And all we could do was just give her higher levels of drugs and see her kind of slip away. We told Katie no matter what the doctor said, we're never going to stop searching for an answer. And as I said, Jenny spent hours and hours and hours just searching for answers. And these things would leave her emotionally drained. If you ever search things on the internet, what do you find? The greatest horror stories, right? The worst things you find on the internet. So she's researching, these problems. She's reading countless stories that just seem to want to take more of the hope away from us. But we kept praying, and we just wanted to believe God. We did believe God, and we kept working. And God finally answered our prayers, and He led us to Dr. Pachetti out in Sacramento, California. And Jenny found this doctor who had pioneered the first surgery that Katie had, the one that went on the inside, the surgery that we later found out had failed. Well, she found him, and we called him up and sent him an email and basically said, here's the scenario. Would you be willing to see Katie? And he said, yeah, absolutely. So we made reservations, and we flew to Sacramento, and he met us after hours, spent extra time with us. But within 15 minutes of our being in his office, he diagnosed the problem. I mean, he knew immediately that she had not fused and that all of her pain was caused by that. And so he said, as much as you don't want another surgery, that's the solution. A second surgery will take away the problem. You need to fuse. And so we began to make arrangements for that. There's a picture of Dr. Pachetti out in California in the Sutter General Hospital where her second surgery was performed. It was so encouraging. Our hearts were so lifted when we saw God answer that prayer and lead us to, we'd been to so many doctors and tried so many solutions, and there it was. And so we made plans then for a third surgery. Or I'm sorry, we had the second surgery. Let me back up, getting ahead of myself. And so as we go out a couple of months later for this surgery, as we're getting checked into the hospital, they call Katie up to the prep room, and as all three of us are getting ready to get on the elevator, I get a tap on my shoulder from a staff person at the hospital and say that they'd like to talk to you for a minute in the financial office. So I went to the financial office, and as Katie's being prepped for surgery, this accountant in the hospital tells me that they just received a letter in the mail that morning saying that our insurance company is refusing to pay for the surgery. So, it was the third thing that I had to deal with in this whole process was just a sense of weariness. I dealt with fear. We battled through hopelessness, but these problems were just relentless. And of course, she had the surgery, and without a lot of detail, it was successful, and she fused, and she got better, and she was going off of the medication a few months after the surgery, and then just kind of hit a brick wall. And we thought she was still getting better. And a lot of you know that the Lord blessed Jenny and me with a sabbatical. We got a grant from Eli Lilly, and we were scheduled several months after her surgery to take the summer off on a sabbatical. We were going to do quite a lot of traveling. And while we were away on the sabbatical, we were down in Australia. We were at Nancy Blackwood's home for the night, and Katie called us that morning, and this was toward the end of the sabbatical, and said, I've tried to hold off telling you this as long as I can, but my pain's back. And she had already contacted Dr. Pachetti on her own, and she'd already set up an appointment back in California. And so we made arrangements on our return trip from our sabbatical to go back to Dr. Pachetti and see him again. And as we were working all of this through, he said that the problem is that the rods from the second surgery are putting so much pressure on the spine that it's causing pain, and those rods are going to have to come out. And we had nights after we got back to Lafayette sitting up with Katie at her bedside. She was just unable to sleep. She spent weeks and weeks just sleeping in a chair. She couldn't drive the pain away, and we were all just so weary, just so tired. And we just didn't want to keep fighting. Katie had said after her second surgery, I don't ever want to have one of these surgeries again. And then, of course, that was the reality we were faced with. And so we did what we had learned before. We just prayed, and we just asked God for His help. And I remember sitting there in the hospital during the second surgery after Katie went in. The insurance, I'd gotten that news. The insurance wasn't going to pay, and we knew that there was no choice but to have the surgery, no matter what the financial implications were going to be. So I said, well, that's fine. If they won't pay, we still want to go ahead with it. They were basically asking if we wanted to do that. And so I went back to the waiting room, and during Katie's surgery, I was reading in the Word, and I came to Psalm 50. And in the middle of that psalm, I read these words. God is speaking here. He says, every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird of the mountains, and everything that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, would I tell you? For the world is mine and all it contains. Shall I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of male goats? And then this instruction, offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and pay your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of trouble. I shall rescue you, and you will honor me. And the Lord just used that passage to really give me comfort and to really trust Him and to just realize God is gonna meet our needs. God is gonna solve this problem. And so as we face this third surgery, we just realize the grace of God is sufficient. His power is perfected in weakness, and we can gladly boast then about our weaknesses so that the power of Christ would be manifested in us. And so, we went through the third surgery, and the rods were removed, and that dealt with that problem. And slowly, since November of 2009, Katie's just been getting progressively better. She had a lot of fights, as she alluded to, with coming off all the drugs that she'd been on for such a long, long time. But God helped her through that and gave us the strength to keep going. And part of what we learned through all this is just how much we need each other, how much God doesn't want us to be an island. Our family has fought the fight together, and each one of us has been called on to make sacrifices. Christy, Katie's older sister, has just been fantastic, just Katie's best friend, and has stood by her and been there for her. And Christy and her husband Ken have had Katie live in their home and have just met the needs. Everyone in our family has just been willing to make sacrifices to help with this. And the church, of course, has been there. They've persevered with us. The congregation in Lafayette has been unbelievably supportive. Time and again, they've lifted us up. But not just here. Across the church, across the RP church, people have prayed. They've called. We've had regular phone calls from people we hardly knew just because they wanted to know how to pray specifically. People have given money to help with the expenses of these trips and these surgeries out to Sacramento. We really experienced the love and the strength of God through His people. And it's been, as Katie said, the most difficult thing that we've had to deal with, but also one in which we've learned so much, and which God has really made Himself known to us. And we're just so thankful for all that Christ has done for us. We know it's because of His death on the cross that we even belong to Him. He's adopted us as His children, and He's taken care of us. He's never turned His back on us. And this last picture, just a picture of a greeting at the hospital coming home from Sacramento. I should just add all the people that have helped. I wanted to kind of share this because there were a lot of people that made the trip to California during that surgery. Our dear friends, the Larsons, Ken and Tina Larson. Tina came out and was with us a couple of days before the surgery. Jeff and Carla Kessler, Jeff's an elder here in Lafayette. The church sent the Kesslers out to be with us for a few days and to be with us through the surgery and the immediate recovery. Our daughter Christy came out and was with us for a long time, just a great help and encouragement. Catherine Metzger made the trip all the way out and spent days with us. And Keith and Becky McGill, again, they made the trip and spent a long time toward the end of our time out there in Sacramento. I don't know how we'd have made it without people doing that kind of thing. It really, really helped us. It made what would have been the most difficult thing to bear on our own a lot more bearable, and God just used the people of God in that way. So we're grateful. God has shown Himself strong and mighty to us in so many different ways. So, Mark, I think that's kind of what we were both going to share, and I don't know if you want to open it up for some questions or how you want to take it from here.
Yeah, very good. Thank you both for that powerful testimony of faith in Christ and also the encouragement of friends and family. And there are several questions on their way to you now via email, but folks listening right now, this is the chance for you to ask some more specific questions. Use that chat box in your lower left-hand corner. You can type your messages there, there, and we will get those over to Dave and Katie as soon as you send them. I know there's a couple there already to take a look at. So if either of you have had a chance to look at the first couple in and would like to answer those, go ahead, and I'll keep forwarding them over as they come.
Yeah, the first question is to Katie. Just tell us where you are now and what you're doing, and I might add to that how you're doing. A lot of people asking, how are you now? So, Katie, why don't you just tell people a little bit about what's happening?
Well, I'm completely off all the pain medication now, and I do still have some pain or discomfort, but it's not anything that's keeping me from living. I'm going to school full-time, and I've got a part-time job. I'm working a little bit, and I'm living in an apartment with some friends, and so I'm back to doing all the normal life things that I'd been wanting to do, and I'm able to do it. So it's been great. I'm just thankful every single day for that.
Someone asked the question, how can people best help families with long-term illnesses and injuries? And I'll just take a stab at answering that. Perseverance, I talked about how the Lord taught me to persevere. I really think that's what's necessary for people that have long, with the emphasis on long-term illnesses and injuries, because it's easy to kind of rise to the occasion when news breaks. What's hard to do is to kind of hang in there with people. Our ordeal has gone on for years now. We don't feel like we're 100% through it, but we're in our 11th year since Katie found out that she had scoliosis. And some people do just get kind of tired of it, kind of tired of somebody being sick all the time or somebody having this need all the time. So I would just encourage, if you have people like that in your life, just ask God for patience and for perseverance and just the willingness to kind of stick in there and help. When you ask questions when we get asked questions, we don't get tired of answering those questions because it's where we're living every day. People that are faced with really difficult suffering, it's not like you're going to bring this up into their minds. So I don't want to remind them of it, or I don't want to bring pain to the surface. It's just there anyway. So ask and look for ways that you can serve and help. We were incredibly lifted up by people's visits, their prayers, their gifts when that kind of thing is necessary really helped us a lot. So those are some things that I think have been helpful to us along the way.
Can I
you want to add to that, Katie?
Yeah, I was just going to say just be a listening ear, because it's easy to always say, oh, just trust God, or it'll be okay, or you'll get through it. But sometimes the best encouragement is just having somebody just sit there and let you just tell them what's going on, and to know that someone's willing to do that. It's hard to share what's going on with people if you're not sure they want to know, or if it's like if you feel like you're wearing them out, especially when it's a long-term thing. It's easy to just start keeping it inside because you think, I want to have friends, I want people to still talk to me, and if I talk about this all the time, people will start staying away. And so, just be willing to listen and to ask questions so that they feel like they can share.
Yeah. Somebody asked the question, what effects has this had on the rest of your family? We've talked a little bit about Katie and her support and that kind of thing. It's a real trial on a family if there are kids at home still, because so much of the attention, so much of the conversation is always focused on the person that's suffering. And so we have a son that was still at home, two sons actually that were still at home, and I think it was really difficult for them. I mean, they had good attitudes. They our youngest son had a lot of compassion, a lot of sympathy, but it is a little bit difficult for every phone call to be about the one that's not doing well. To hear the same, they hear the same story and the repeating of the last doctor appointment over and over and over again. So they just get tired of it, and they have to bear a lot. So Jenny and I just both realized we had to carve out time to focus on the other kids, to do some special things with them, to make sure that they didn't get lost in the shuffle. And that's a pretty important thing to do. And that's another way I think people in the congregation, if you're wanting to help people, look for the needs of the siblings as well. And there may well be some needs that you could meet there that would be a real encouragement, real help to them.
Very good. There's another one on the way, which we'll get to you in a second. In the meantime, as we continue to work through the questions that you're sending in, please keep sending those through the chat box. You see on your screen next month, the first Thursday, as all of our webinars are, Noah Bailey, pastor of the RP Church in Enid, Oklahoma, we'll be talking about ministering to military families. It used to be that if you lived in San Diego or places like that, that was something that we dealt with. But today, congregations, no matter where you're at, with the way the military is set up with reserves and things like that, we all minister to military families in ways. So Pastor Bailey has some interesting ideas and things to share with us concerning that aspect of ministry. And these conversations bring up some other ideas too, practical things that we can do as we help each other in times of struggle and trial. I remember during my mother's long illness that frequently people would send meals, and they would send a meal for 10. And it was my father and my mother wasn't eating, so there was a lot of food which ended up going to waste. And so sometimes thinking through those things, or as simple as labeling the food containers so that he knew who to get them back to later, that caused some undue stress that sometimes we don't think about. But with once you go through circumstances like this, then you do see some of those things, and sometimes our help isn't always as helpful as it could be.
There's a question here about medications. The fact that when you're on heavy medications, as Katie was on heavy narcotics for a long period of time, it can make it difficult to concentrate. It can make it difficult to do things. It can make it difficult to communicate, whether you're talking about spiritual things or other matters. And the question really has to do with the fact: is there a point where a person might choose to deal with more pain and less medication, so that they can be in a better frame of mind? Katie, do you want to talk to that at all?
Sure. Yeah, certainly, but it's a really individual thing. I mean, each person handles pain differently and handles medication. People's bodies respond differently to medication. So I think it's probably just a really personal thing. How much pain is that person willing to deal with? And I think they just kind of have to decide, okay, do I want my mind more right now, or do I want comfort right now? And there's points where you just need the relief from the pain, and so you increase the medication. And there's times where the medication has really nasty effects on your mind, and so you decrease it to have your mind back, and you deal with the pain a little more. It's a difficult question to really answer, because it's just very personal, and everybody's so different. So I think it's just a matter of that person determining what they can handle and choosing which is the worst enemy, I guess.
Well, in Katie's case, we weren't talking about, kind of a headache or even a bad headache. And we're talking about intense, life-stopping kind of pain where you just can't function. I mean, that's the kind of level of pain she was dealing with. And so the reality of it is there's not a lot going to happen on either front. I mean, if you got too much pain medicine, it does cut down on some of the effectiveness and functions. But if the pain medicine's not there and the pain really escalates, there's no communication, there's nothing happening then either. That just stops things. So we were constantly with Katie kind of working and leading the way, but with Jenny and me trying to help, trying to balance the pain medications, phone calls to doctors. We always wanted her on as a little amount of pain as possible. So we're always trying to reduce the pain medication if we could, but it was just really hard to accomplish. So that's a really, really tough thing, and these drugs are really, really nasty. But sometimes, and for us, it was a lifeline while we found the help that we needed.
Well, this webinar has been recorded, and tomorrow morning you'll be able to go to the RPTS website. That's www.rpts.edu. Look under the News and Events section. You'll see the link there. You'll be able to see the slides and hear the audio just as you have seen now. So you can, friends and family who were unable to attend will be able to do so. And I think an appropriate ending is a comment that came in. The comment says, "Thank you for sharing, Dave and Katie. Praising the Lord for His strength shining through Katie and the conquering love of Dave and Jenny as parents." Well, that's the end of our webinar, and Lord willing, we'll see you next month. Until then, have a great day, and glory to God.
Thank you.